Jimmy Page isn't just a guitarist, he's a legend, a pioneer, and one of the most influential musicians to ever pick up a six string. As the creative force behind Led Zeppelin, he didn't just play songs, he built worlds. From the haunting acoustic passages of Stairway to Heaven to the earth shaking riffs of Whole Lotta Love, Page's music redefined rock and set a standard that generations of guitarists have chased ever since. But Page's rise to the top wasn't a straight path paved with nothing but praise. The music industry, especially the rock world of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, was competitive to its core. Behind the screaming crowds, platinum records, and sold-out stadiums, there was another story, one of rivalries, artistic clashes, and quiet feuds between the best players in the business. Some of these rivalries were fueled by friendly competition, the kind that pushes an artist to reach new heights. Others were born from deep disagreements about style, philosophy, or even personal matters. And a few, well, they were pure, unapologetic dislike. Today we're counting down 10 guitarists Jimmy Page reportedly had rivalries with, from old friends who became competitors to contemporaries who challenged him for the spotlight, and even younger players who tried to take the crown. Each rivalry tells us something about who Page was, and not just as a guitarist, but as a person. Number 10. Jeff Beck. Before Led Zeppelin was even an idea, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck were young guitarists making waves in the tight-knit world of British rock. They weren't just aware of each other. They were friends, collaborators, and for a time bandmates in the Yardbirds. Both were innovators, pushing the electric guitar into unexplored territory. Beck had a fiery, unpredictable energy in his playing, while Page was precise, methodical, and obsessed with perfecting arrangements. When Beck left the Yardbirds in 1966, frustrated with management and internal tensions, Page took over as lead guitarist. Under his direction, the band's sound became heavier, sharper, and more aggressive, laying the groundwork for what would become Led Zeppelin. This shift marked the beginning of their parallel but very different career paths. Jeff Beck went on to carve his own unique lane, diving into jazz fusion, instrumental rock, and a level of technical experimentation that left even seasoned musicians in awe. Page, meanwhile, assembled Led Zeppelin and built a sound so massive it would dominate stadiums and redefine what hard rock could be. Despite public appearances of friendship, the shadow of competition never really went away. Each new album Beck released, Page noticed. Each groundbreaking Zeppelin track, Beck heard. Their careers became like two parallel lines, never intersecting again in a band setting, but always running side by side, each man aware of what the other was doing. It wasn't animosity in the traditional sense. There were no tabloid-worthy insults or public fallouts. But it was the kind of rivalry that happens when two masters of their craft come from the same place, share the same history, and each believe deep down that they could be the one who truly set the bar. In a way, that unspoken competition might have been one of the reasons both guitarists kept pushing themselves, ensuring that their legacies would never fade. Number 9, Pete Townshend. Jimmy Page and Pete Townshend may have come up in the same British rock explosion of the 1960s, but their approaches to guitar playing, performance, and even what rock should mean were fundamentally different. Those differences became the fuel for a subtle, long-running rivalry between two of the most recognizable guitarists of their generation. Townshend, the driving force behind The Who, was all about power, motion, and raw physical energy. His famous windmill strum, his ear-splitting feedback, and his habit of smashing guitars at the end of shows weren't just stunts, they were statements. For Townshend, the guitar was an extension of his body and his stagecraft, a weapon as much as a musical instrument. Page, on the other hand, was a craftsman and a sonic architect. While his live performances could be electrifying, his focus was often on precision, layering, and crafting the perfect soundscape both in the studio and on stage. Page's work was about composition as much as it was about performance. He was building songs like cathedrals, brick by brick, riff by riff. These differences spilled into public perception and occasionally public comments. Townshend, never shy with an opinion, made remarks over the years that downplayed Led Zeppelin's artistry. In one interview, he suggested Zeppelin's music could be a bit of a hammer in search of a nail, a comment that, while not overtly hostile, was undeniably dismissive. It painted Zeppelin as all force and no finesse, a critique that would have irked Page, who prided himself on nuance and detail in his arrangements. Page, for his part, didn't respond in kind in public. That wasn't his style. But according to those close to him, he didn't appreciate Townshend's digs and saw them as coming from a place of competitiveness. While Townshend's performances were about shock, energy, and breaking the rules, Page's were about control, mastery, and bending the rules to his will. The rivalry between them was never a shouting match in the press or a feud that spilled onto stages, but it was real. A philosophical divide between two guitar heroes at the top of their game. Fans debated endlessly over who was the superior player, and both men, whether they admitted it or not, were aware of those comparisons. In the end, Townshend and Page represented two sides of the same coin. One thrived on chaos, the other on structure, and in that contrast, their quiet competition helped define the spectrum of what rock guitar could be. Number 8, Keith Richards. Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones and Jimmy Page were both disciples of the blues, both architects of some of rock's most enduring riffs, and both deeply influential in shaping the sound of modern guitar. But despite their shared love for the roots of rock, there was a persistent undercurrent of tension between them, one that combined stylistic differences, personal remarks, and the inevitable competition between two of the biggest bands on the planet. Richards has always been a minimalist at heart. His guitar work with the Rolling Stones is built on groove, feel, and economy, a raw, unpolished swagger that relies on the spaces between the notes as much as the notes themselves. He's the embodiment of less is more, crafting riffs so simple they feel inevitable, yet so perfect they become part of rock's DNA. Page, on the other hand, thrived on complexity and scale. His arrangements for Led Zeppelin were often intricate, layered, and meticulously constructed. He blended blues, folk, and hard rock with experimental recording techniques to create massive, almost cinematic soundscapes. So where Richards would strip a song down to its bare bones, Page would build it up into a fortress. And the friction between the two came partly from these opposing philosophies, but also from Richards' famously blunt tongue. Over the years, he made several dismissive comments about Zeppelin, sometimes portraying their heavier sound as excessive or overindulgent. He once referred to their music as a bit of white noise with a beat. A quip that, intentional or not, belittled Page's craftsmanship. Page, true to form, never engaged in a public war of words. He wasn't one to trade barbs in the press, but those who knew him say he didn't forget comments like that. Richard's casual jabs likely felt like more than just offhand remarks. They were shots at the legitimacy of Zeppelin's artistry, something Page had spent his entire career building and protecting. Despite the tension, there was always a baseline of professional respect. Richards never denied Page's talent, and Page never dismissed the Rolling Stones' place in history. But their differences in style and philosophy meant they were never going to be close allies. It was a rivalry without open hostility, but it was real nonetheless. Two giants of the guitar, each confident that their approach was the truest expression of rock, each knowing the other represented a completely different vision of what that meant. And in the competitive world of classic rock, that kind of divide is enough to keep a quiet rivalry alive for decades. Number 7. Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page came from the same musical breeding ground. The explosive mid-1960s London blues scene, they were both steeped in the American blues tradition, both revered for their skill, and both considered part of the so-called Holy Trinity of British guitarists alongside Jeff Beck. But their careers and their musical philosophies took them in different directions. That divergence would form the backbone of a quiet but long-lasting rivalry. By the time Page was gaining attention as an in-demand session guitarist and later as a member of the Yardbirds, Clapton had already been crowned a guitar god. Graffiti declaring Clapton as God appeared on London walls, and he was widely hailed as the ultimate blues purist. His work with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, Cream, and later Derek and the Dominoes cemented his reputation as a player with soul, feel, and authenticity. Page respected Clapton's technique and expressive phrasing, but he bristled at the idea that Clapton represented the only legitimate path for blues-inspired rock guitar. While Clapton often stuck closely to the blues form, Page was determined to stretch it, blending it with folk, psychedelia, and hard rock, and incorporating elaborate studio techniques to create entirely new sonic textures. The two collaborated early on, famously on the track Beck's Bolero alongside Jeff Beck, but as Led Zeppelin rose, subtle digs began to emerge. Clapton has at times been lukewarm in his praise of Zeppelin's heavier sound, suggesting it strayed too far from the blues' emotional core. And in interviews, he's hinted that Zeppelin's bombast overshadowed the nuance he valued most in music. Page never engaged in a public feud with Clapton, but insiders say he was aware of those comments and disagreed with the notion that Zeppelin lacked depth or subtlety. To Page, expanding the blues into new territory was not a betrayal. It was the point. Their rivalry wasn't built on personal dislike so much as a philosophical divide. Clapton saw himself as a guardian of tradition, while Page saw himself as an innovator, unafraid to tear tradition down and rebuild it. Both approaches produced timeless music, but they were different enough to keep a subtle tension alive whenever their names came up in the same conversation. It was the kind of rivalry where both men could acknowledge the other's greatness, but never truly agree on what the highest form of guitar playing should be. And for two musicians who define themselves by their artistic convictions, that quiet disagreement was enough to keep them on parallel, never quite intersecting paths. Number 6, Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page's story is one of the most famous friends-turned-rivals tales in rock history. And unlike some rivalries fueled purely by ego, theirs had a foundation of deep mutual respect. They grew up in the same part of England, attended the same schools, and even played in the same local bands during their teenage years. Both were obsessed with the guitar, constantly experimenting with sounds, techniques, and equipment. When Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds in 1965, it was Jeff Beck who stepped in to fill his shoes. Beck's inventive use of distortion, sustain, and feedback set the band apart from its peers and pushed the electric guitar into new territory. But when Beck himself left in 1966 after clashing with management and growing frustrated with the band's direction, Page, who had already been contributing to the group as a bassist and second guitarist, took over the lead guitar role. This transition didn't create immediate bad blood, but it did set up a long-term comparison between the two. Beck dove into a more experimental solo career, exploring jazz fusion, instrumental rock, and pushing the limits of guitar tone and technique. Page, meanwhile, formed Led Zeppelin and took over the world with a heavier, more bombastic sound that filled stadiums and shattered sales records. While they occasionally played together and were always cordial in public, there was an undeniable sense of competition in the air. Beck was known for slyly acknowledging Zeppelin's commercial dominance while emphasizing that his own work was more musically adventurous. Page in turn admired Beck's technical brilliance, but quietly took pride in the fact that Zeppelin's influence extended far beyond the guitar community into the cultural mainstream. The rivalry was never about tearing each other down. It was about raising the stakes. Each new project from one would be heard by the other. Each groundbreaking live performance would ripple through the grapevine. And both men knew that their careers, though very different, would forever be linked in the minds of fans and historians. In many ways, Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page pushed each other to greatness without ever directly confronting one another. It was a rivalry built on shared history, parallel ambition, and the knowledge that only a handful of people in the world truly understood the level at which they were operating, and they both happened to be on that list. Number 5, Jimi Hendrix. Few guitarists in history have cast as long a shadow as Jimi Hendrix. By the late 1960s, Hendrix had become a phenomenon, a player whose raw talent, fearless creativity, and electrifying stage presence made him an almost mythical figure. Jimmy Page, already building his own reputation with the Yardbirds and as a sought-after session player, couldn't ignore the seismic impact Hendrix was having on the guitar world. Hendrix and Page were very different kinds of musicians. Hendrix was a force of nature, improvising wildly, coaxing unearthly sounds out of his Stratocaster, and performing with a mix of technical genius and sheer showmanship. He didn't just play the guitar, he attacked it, caressed it, and made it wail like it had a soul of its own. Page, by contrast, was the master architect, carefully constructing layered arrangements and crafting a distinct sonic identity for each song. He brought the precision of a producer to the chaos of rock and roll. While there is no record of the two having a personal feud, there was an undeniable competitive tension. The press and fans often compared them, sparking debates about who was the best guitarist of the era. Hendrix, known for his playful but pointed humor, once made comments suggesting that Led Zeppelin's early sound leaned heavily on styles already circulating in London's blues rock scene, a remark that some interpreted as a dig at Page's originality. Page, for his part, kept his thoughts on Hendrix mostly private, though he reportedly admired his talent. But he was also fiercely protective of Zeppelin's identity and likely bristled at the constant comparisons. The truth is, their rivalry wasn't fueled by personal dislike so much as the fact that they were both trying to define what rock guitar could be. And they were doing it at the exact same time, in very different ways. Hendrix's untimely death in 1970 meant that their competition was cut short, leaving fans to wonder how their relationship and the evolution of rock guitar might have developed if both had continued to innovate side by side. In the end, the Hendrix-Page dynamic was one of mutual awareness, quiet competition, and the kind of respect that can only exist between two players who understood the weight of the mantle they carried. Number 4, Ritchie Blackmore. Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore both stood at the pinnacle of hard rock guitar in the late 1960s and 1970s, leading two of the most powerful bands of the era, Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple. While they shared a mutual respect for each other's abilities, they were also locked in a quiet but intense rivalry for dominance in the emerging world of heavy rock. Blackmore was a different kind of player than Page, technically precise, with a sharp, aggressive picking style and a fascination with classical scales. He brought a distinct neoclassical influence to Deep Purple's sound. Songs like Highway Star and Burn showcased his blistering speed and surgical accuracy, qualities that guitar purists adored. Page, meanwhile, built Zeppelin's music on a foundation of groove, feel, and layered arrangements. His guitar work was less about flawless execution, more about creating a massive sonic landscape, riffs, textures, and dynamics that could move an entire stadium. The rivalry was amplified by the fact that Zeppelin and Deep Purple were often compared in the press. Both bands were loud, heavy, and technically gifted, and both had massive followings. But where Zeppelin cultivated an air of mystique, limiting interviews and avoiding overexposure, Deep Purple worked relentlessly on the road, earning a reputation as one of the tightest live bands in the business. Blackmore wasn't one to bite his tongue. Over the years, he made a few offhand remarks, suggesting that Zeppelin's success owed as much to image and marketing as to musicianship. The kind of comments that, while not outright insults, could easily get under Page's skin. Page, in turn, kept his responses measured, but those close to him say he was well aware of the competitive undertone. The truth is, both guitarists were pushing the boundaries of what rock could sound like, but they approached it from opposite ends of the spectrum. Blackmore with technical mastery and a classical edge, Page with atmospheric vision and genre-bending creativity. Their rivalry was as much about philosophy as it was about skill, and it gave fans endless material for the who's better debates that still pop up decades later. And while they never engaged in a public feud, the unspoken competition between Page and Blackmore helped shape the very sound of hard rock in the 1970s, a sound that still inspires guitarists to this day. Number 3, Eddie Van Halen. By the late 1970s, rock guitar was evolving fast, and Eddie Van Halen was at the center of that transformation. With the release of Van Halen's debut album in 1978, Eddie burst onto the scene like a meteor, armed with a groundbreaking two-handed tapping technique, lightning-fast runs, and a fearless approach to tone and gear. Practically overnight, he became the new benchmark for rock guitar, and naturally, comparisons to Jimmy Page started flooding in. Eddie himself was open about the fact that Page was one of his early influences. In interviews, he credited Zeppelin's music, particularly Page's riffs and arrangements, as part of what inspired him to pick up the guitar. But as Van Halen's fame grew, Eddie began to carve out his own legend, and with it came a subtle shift in tone. While he often spoke respectfully of Page's creativity, he was also candid about his opinion that Page's live performances could be sloppy. That remark struck a nerve with Zeppelin fans and reportedly with Page himself. For Page, hearing that kind of critique from a younger player, especially one who had clearly drawn inspiration from him, may have been frustrating. He had always prioritized feel, atmosphere, and emotional impact over machine-like precision, believing that rock's magic often lived in the imperfections. Eddie, on the other hand, was redefining the role of the guitar hero for a new generation, one that increasingly valued technical wizardry and jaw-dropping solos. This wasn't a feud in the tabloid sense, but it was a generational rivalry. Page represented the mastery of the 1970s, a player who had already conquered the world and shaped the language of rock guitar. Eddie represented the future, a new wave of players who were taking the instrument into uncharted technical territory. And whether either man wanted it or not, the media and fans framed it as a passing of the torch. While Page never directly hit back at Eddie's comments, those who knew him say he was too proud and too aware of his own influence to let such critiques slide by unnoticed. At the same time, Eddie's own humility in later years softened the edge of their rivalry as he acknowledged that Page's innovation was the foundation on which much of his own work was built. In the end, the Page-Van Halen dynamic became one of those classic rock narratives, the legend meeting the prodigy, each reshaping the instrument in their own era, each admired when measured against the other. Number 2, Robert Plant. When people think of Jimmy Page's career, Robert Plant is right there beside him. Together, they were the core creative force of Led Zeppelin. Page is the mastermind behind the music. Plant is the golden-haired frontman whose voice could soar, snarl, and seduce in equal measure. On stage, they looked like a perfect partnership, but behind the scenes, their relationship was more complicated, and at times it bordered on rivalry. In the early Zeppelin years, Page and Plant were in lockstep. Page wrote and arranged the bulk of the music, layering guitars, crafting riffs, and producing tracks that would become rock anthems. Plant brought the lyrics, the charisma, and a vocal range that gave Page's compositions a voice unlike any other. Together, they created magic. But as Zeppelin's fame exploded, so did the differences in how they viewed the future of the band. Plant was restless. By the mid-1970s, he was eager to experiment beyond Zeppelin's hard rock foundations, drawing inspiration from world music, rootsy Americana, and stripped-down acoustic styles. Page, while also open to new sounds, was more committed to preserving Zeppelin's signature power and mystique. That difference in vision sometimes put them at odds in the studio and on the road. After the death of drummer John Bonham in 1980, Zeppelin ended, but the tension between Page and Plant didn't. Page wanted to honor the Zeppelin legacy, and over the years he entertained multiple reunion offers. Plant, however, was reluctant, fearing that reviving the band could tarnish its history. Even when they reunited as Page and Plant in the mid-1990s, creative disagreements flared. Page leaned toward heavier, more elaborate arrangements. Plant preferred a looser, more organic approach. To outsiders, it might not have looked like a rivalry, but those who worked with them say there was always a push and pull over creative control, direction, and ownership of Zeppelin's legacy. Each man knew the other was indispensable to the magic they created, and that made their differences all the more frustrating. In many ways, this was the most personal rivalry of Page's life. It wasn't about one-upmanship in the press or trying to outplay another guitarist. It was about two artists who had built something monumental together and who each had their own idea of how that monument should stand. And like many great creative partnerships, the very tension that could pull them apart was also part of what made their work so unforgettable. Number 1, John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones may not have had the spotlight that Robert Plant or Jimmy Page commanded on stage, but within Led Zeppelin, he was every bit as essential. As the band's bassist, keyboardist, and all-around multi-instrumentalist, Jones provided the glue that held Zeppelin's music together. And that quiet power sometimes put him in subtle competition with Page. In the early years, Page was the unquestioned leader of the band. He recruited each member, produced the albums, and oversaw the band's overall sound and direction. Jones was the quiet professional, a classically trained musician who could switch seamlessly between instruments, write sophisticated arrangements, and bring an unexpected depth to Zeppelin's heaviest songs. While Page focused on riffs and atmosphere, Jones added textures and harmonic layers that often elevated the music into something transcendent. The rivalry between them wasn't loud or public, it was more of a creative tug-of-war. Well, Jones occasionally pushed for more influence over the band's songwriting and arrangements, suggesting ideas that sometimes clashed with Page's vision. Page, protective of his role as the band's architect, wasn't always receptive to those suggestions, and while Jones rarely voiced frustration in public, those close to the band have said he sometimes felt overlooked when it came to recognition for his contributions. After Zeppelin ended in 1980, the differences between them became more visible. When Page and Plant reunited in the 1990s for new music and tours, Jones was notably left out of the initial plans. He later joked about finding out from the press that the project was happening. A remark that, while delivered with humor, hinted at real resentment. Fans too noticed the omission, speculating that old creative tensions had never fully healed. Still, even with those undercurrents, Page has always acknowledged Jones's talent and importance to Zeppelin's sound. And Jones, for his part, has consistently performed Zeppelin's music with passion when the opportunities arose. Their rivalry was never about trying to destroy one another's legacy. It was about two strong musical minds navigating the same space, each convinced of their vision and occasionally stepping on each other's toes in the process. It may have been subtle, but make no mistake. Within Led Zeppelin, the quietest member still had enough weight to challenge the band's leader, and that in itself is a testament to John Paul Jones's influence. Jimmy Page's career was built on genius, ambition, and a relentless drive to create something that had never been heard before. But along the way, he crossed paths with other greats, some friends, some foes, and many who existed in that gray area in between. These rivalries, whether born out of artistic differences, competition for the spotlight, or simple personality clashes, became part of the story of rock itself. From contemporaries like Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Pete Townshend, and Ritchie Blackmore, to generational challenges from Eddie Van Halen, each rivalry pushed Page to prove himself again and again. Some were about style, the minimalist groove of Keith Richards versus Page's layered complexity. Others were deeply personal, like the creative push and pull with Robert Plant and the quiet competition with John Paul Jones inside Led Zeppelin itself. And then there were the legends like Jimi Hendrix, whose very existence as a once-in-a-lifetime talent kept Page in the constant pursuit of his own artistic edge. None of these rivalries erased the respect these musicians often had for each other. In many cases, they fueled it. Greatness recognizes greatness, but it also competes with it. And for Jimmy Page, that competition helped shape the legacy we still celebrate today. Rivalries can divide people, but they can also push them to their limits. Without these moments of tension, we might not have gotten the same fire and Whole Lotta Love, the same precision in Kashmir, or the same raw power in Zeppelin's legendary live shows. So now we turn the question to you. Which of these rivalries do you think defined Jimmy Page the most? And who do you think truly stood toe-to-toe with him as an equal? Let us know in the comments, and if you love deep dives into rock history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next countdown.